To those watching online and to everybody who has joined us here in Nijmegen. It's a real pleasure, a real treat to get to be in person. On behalf of the Rewriting Global Orthodoxy ERC-funded project, it's my pleasure to welcome everybody. My name is Christopher Sheklian, one of the postdocs at the project. And our group has been sort of fully together now since about January, but it's quite thrilling because only in the past couple months have we really truly had the opportunity to be together in person. And just last week, we attended a conference as a group, and now we're really excited to host this really thrilling few days here on Oriental Orthodox visual cultures in Europe. So tonight, we kick off this conference with our keynote speaker, but we're really looking forward to a few days of these events and getting to tackle this, I think, very important and interesting aspect of our overall project looking at Oriental Orthodox Christians in Europe. So this conference has been a joint effort of all of the team. My colleague Gaetan de Roy and I, the two postdocs, have been organizing as we've gone along with input from all of the team. And so we're just really thrilled to have everybody here, again, both online and in person. And I will let the project leader, Dr. Helene Murray Vandenberg, introduce the project in a little more detail.
Thank you so much, Chris. Yes, it has been a great pleasure to work with all of you and Chris and Gaetan and Elise, where is she in the back, preparing this conference. So glad to have you all here. Also a special welcome, let me see where my stuff is. A special welcome to the students of the class of Eric Venbergs who are joining us from via Zoom. Be assured you will later also have a chance to put questions. After my introduction, there's no time for questions, but at the end, after Professor Morgan's lecture, we do have time for questions also from the people watching us via Zoom. If you're watching via the stream, that's not possible, but if you're watching via Zoom, you can join in and have questions. So very, very briefly on the project. In fact, most of it has already been mentioned by Chris just now. But this is our first actual conference. We had smaller stuff before and joined a bigger conference organized by the Institute of Eastern Christian Studies a while ago. And in this particular project, we are kind of, on the one hand, expanding and on the other hand, zooming in on the aspect of visual cultures in connection to the textual cultures that are the basis of our projects. Rewriting Global Orthodoxy works on the texts of the Oriental Christians in Europe, mostly, in this particular conference, we zoom in on what this also means for how things look, not just what is being written, but how things look. And this means, on the one hand, looking at images as such, but also as to the culture of images that we see when we look at these churches. For the record, I also included the names of all the project members here. So we mentioned already Gaetan de Roy and Chris Sheklian and Elise Agazarian. There's two ICT technicians who are not here, but who are helping us with setting up the database. Wessel Stoop and Emmanuel Gamilakis. And then there's the three PhDs, Haptom Johannes, Jan Game and Matja Milicic. They are sitting right there. So I think most of you have met by now. So starting with the idea of Oriental Christians, even that, of course, is something to be thought about. What actually do you mean when you use this term? We use it mostly to indicate the groups that also call themselves with this title in the connection, for example, of ecumenical gatherings as distinct from the Eastern Orthodox, thinking of the Russians, the Greeks and all of that, and the Orientals as a distinct group in that wider context. I have to say, and those of you who know me, that I would also often include the Assyrian Church of the East in this. Technically, they are not part of the group of Oriental Christians if you have the Christological definition. taking that as a part, but I think in many respects they are part of this group of non-Chalcedonian Christians, and it works to include them in these discussions. But mostly and mainly it is the Oriental churches, the Copts, the Tuatha churches, the Armenians, the Syriac Orthodox. These are the groups that are also represented in the project. And you see here images all taken in the Middle East at various times, and giving you already a sense of the different types within these churches in as how they furnish their churches. Of course, in all of these churches you will have more kind of outgoing churches. I mean, churches with big, bright interiors, and churches that are more simple and modest. But it gives you some sense of it. And I think one of the things that undergirds the project is that on the one hand there are all these similarities between this particular group of churches, but at the same time, and I don't have to explain it to you, there are also lots of differences, especially when you talk about visual culture. There are real differences between the churches. So the project focuses on the period in which these members of these churches migrated to Europe. So we took the last 50 years as our kind of starting point. Members from these churches from the Middle East, from Africa, migrated to Europe and started to build new lives in Europe. Of course, they also migrated to the US, they migrated to Australia, they migrated to other parts of the Middle East, but we are focusing on the groups that ended up in Europe. And you see some images here again. On the one hand, very different, but also similarities. Similarities in processes of migration, in why and how people ended up here. Also differences. I included the image of the Armenian church in Amsterdam, which is a church that goes back a long time, much longer than the Syriacs and the Copts in the Netherlands. But at the same time, the contemporary Armenian community in the Netherlands is not so different in makeup and migration history from the Copts and the Syriac Orthodox, because there is this gap between the older Armenian migration and mercantile communities and the current community. What you also see here is that you have this mix of the usage of local elements, local churches. This was a Dutch, not a Reformed church in the Netherlands, a Gereformeerde kerk, which the Copts rebuilt into a Coptic church. Well, the Armenian church was their original church, but in a very kind of 18th century style, which also has a very Dutch accent to it. These Tuatha Christians are meeting in a, well, I don't know exactly even Hapton, but it's a... yeah, but also in the local church and yeah, exactly. And what you see on the left is the burial place of the graveyard of the Syriac Orthodox, which really was built from scratch. And but also when you look at it, is a mixture of kind of Middle Eastern elements in how a cemetery should look like, and local elements. So it gives you already some sense of where we are. But what we do in the project is really focusing on what is being produced as to texts, booklets, books, and increasingly also online materials, because they are so important in understanding this. So just a kind of sense of how this looks like, the various collections, the various libraries. I think the right one is more Ephraim, and this was in the Coptic church in Amsterdam. What we are doing is putting these things in a database, and by now the building of the database is kind of the technical part is mostly finished, and this is how we work in it, and we're now kind of working on a form of the database that would also be open to the general public, and this is one of the things they showed us this week, the technicians, which might be like a front page of how this database looks like. And I think this immediately gives you a sense of what this visual culture of the Oriental Christians kind of entails, how wide it is, how wide-ranging, how many different things, but also the similarities in how these book covers look like. And we're not only looking at book covers, but book covers give a nice insight in what is going on, as in how people produce books. This is not a big thing about all the things we are seeing now and are going to do, but just as a first start, here are a few of the kind of more technical, theoretical books, authors that have inspired us in this particular line of thinking. The first one, well, this is not necessarily the order of how they came to us, but the first one today definitely is David Morgan's The Sacred Gaze, so that was the reason that we invited him. Not at all about Oriental Christians, but about religious visual culture, and in that sense was very inspiring for us to read and inspired us to think about this. Three other authors, Taylor, Apodurai, and Meyer, helped us to think about the connection between images, imagining communities, and painting, seeing your community, visualizing your community in the Middle East and here. So thinking about the relationship between the actual images, which you can collect and compare, and how these images tell you something about how I mean, this is something every group does, but how groups see themselves in the world, how groups relate to other groups. What kind of images you use tells us something about how do you connect these images here that connect this building with the ancient history of Nijmegen. So this is a very, very modern building, and then you see all these images that connect to medieval Nijmegen history. And so all of us, all of the time, are using images to try and express something of our belonging, where we are, to what we look. And so this is something that we also want to kind of see and study in the Oriental churches. This is a little setup that I photographed in Amsterdam in the Coptic church, where there I think it was done by children. I'm not entirely certain in a Sunday school context to visualize at that point a few years ago the Coptic church in the Netherlands. So which churches are there and how do they look? It also tells you something about all kinds of influences. And one of the things, and this is also a link to the work of Professor Morgan, you have these, in this case especially the Jesus image, that you find in various kind of religious cultures, in Protestant ones, in Catholic ones, in evangelical ones, and you see how they are being used in the Oriental churches. So I think the left and the far right are both Coptic, and the middle two are Syriac. And you see similar Jesus types that are being used and reused in a fairly Oriental context. So it's a mixture of elements that come from the history of the churches themselves, the use of Syriac and Arabic. I think on the right one, there is the image of this same Coptic church included. So there are elements that are very typical for that particular church in that moment, and there are elements that speak to a wider Christian visual culture, not merely a Coptic or Armenian or Syriac visual culture. At the same time, you see how in these churches you see that printing and the visual culture of printing also resonates with the older manuscript tradition. So on the one hand, you have these kind of modern global Christian influences. You also have the influences from the long tradition in the past. And so on the right are both, so the inside and the outside of an Eritrean prayer book, and the left, the Syriac Orthodox not hymnal, the liturgy, the Eucharist. And there you see this mixture of classical elements from the classical tradition that are being modernized, sure, and they are printed, and in this case also translated in the Syriac case. And also the image in the Tewahedo one is a kind of a modern thing in the manuscript, but still in the manuscript tradition. So that's another interesting line to explore. So this mixture of manuscript and book tradition. And then here, some other things also showing different types of influences, the use of different languages, Dutch, German, Spanish on the right, yet another visual influences, photographs, very important. And one other thing also, which you find in the Syriac tradition, but also in the others, the link with the transnational church. So the books are printed in Europe, but they have the imprimatur of the patriarch. So the things are not in isolation done in Europe, but they are part of the big church, and they are part of a larger world than just what is happening in Europe. And you see that at various levels. Not for everything, so that's interesting to us also to see what is being produced purely local and with local emphasis and local actors, and what is produced in connection with patriarchates and bishops outside the Netherlands, outside Europe. And almost at the end, partly because of the COVID epidemics, partly also because it just is forced upon you the importance of the online world. So in the beginning, when I started the project, I really thought we should focus on the printed matter. Just to be, not to do everything, and just to restrict ourselves to actual printed booklets. But in fact, during the epidemics, we had to do a lot of online work because that was the only thing we could do. But it also showed us how important this online world is, and that understanding the online world helps to understand what is printed. So some things are printed and continue to be printed, and other things are merely online. And what is it? And why do people choose the one or the other or both? So that is something we find very interesting. And for example, Gaëtan has already started to work on that a bit. So how are these two related? Again, you see also this transnational aspect and this transnational and local. This is an interesting song in the Syriac Orthodox community from Sweden about corona. So it's Kurhono and corona. That was a great way to connect the two. So illness and corona. So that worked very well. But you see then also the use of the Swedish flag, but other kinds of images. Absolutely fascinating. And to finalize my kind of brief introduction, it's not, of course, it's not just about text. It's also about things happening in real life. So that is also our struggle. For the past 1.5 years, we could do very little in speaking to people, interviewing people, participating in masses, in liturgies, and all of that. So this is something that I came across on YouTube, something from 2019, from before the COVID epidemics. Yeah, I see the bishop nodding. Maybe others were there as well. I don't know. I'm looking. So it was a very nice event organized by the Copts. Well, I'm not sure whether it was in the Coptic church, exactly. And so you had the choirs from all the different churches that were performing songs in this church. So it gives you a sense that Oriental is not, of course, it's not just about the images. It's part of a larger culture in which there's also this interconnections between the Oriental churches. So this is it for now, just to give you some sense of the things we are interested in, a sense of the things that we hope we can discuss in more depth in the coming days, and also a sense in which I hope that Professor Morgan's lecture, who comes from a completely different perspective, I think can help us in analyzing the things that we see here. I give now the floor to Gaëtan to bring us to the next part of the lecture.
Thank you very much, Helene, for this very nice introduction. I will be very short and just present shortly Professor Morgan and then give him the floor to speak about the forest of images. So, Professor Morgan is a professor of religious studies at Duke University. He received his PhD at the University of Chicago in 1990, and is currently a director of the graduate studies in Duke's PhD program on religion. He has published several important books on religious visual cultures, among which The Lure of Images, A History of Religion and Visual Media in America, The Forge of Vision, A Visual History of Modern Christianity, and his last book has just been published this year under the title The Think About Religion, An Introduction to the Material Study of Religion. And we invited Professor Morgan because we have read his work during our meeting with the team, and he has inspired us to try to address this question of images, which is hard for a lot of scholars of social sciences. It's something we have difficulty to deal with, and I must say that the work of David Morgan has been very useful for us and very instrumental in introducing us to those questions. So, Professor Morgan, I leave you the floor for your presentation. Thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I will try to share the screen here. There we go. I hope you can see that. It's a pleasure to join you. I want to thank the organizers for the opportunity to speak with you. When I started to prepare the remarks for this presentation, I looked closely at Orthodox materials, but realized quickly I'm not an expert. You all are, so I prefer to rely on your expertise. Today, I will be speaking about visual culture in broader terms, often drawing on some Protestant material that I know, not to present Protestantism as any kind of norm, particularly for the study of orthodoxy. That does not work very well, but to present some general remarks about the nature of visuality and some of the leading features of religious visual culture, and then really rely on you to extract from those ideas whatever might be helpful in your work as you study the visual culture of Oriental Christianity. So let me begin with that. When he arrived in Calcutta in 1830, Scottish missionary Alexander Duff encountered a world of images that his Reformed Protestantism had known only through his reading of biblical prophets from ancient Israel. Duff published his account of the missions in India in 1839, several years after he had returned to Scotland, and he offered a fascinating description of the annual festival of the goddess Durga in Calcutta. I'd like to quote at length from his account. This is his text here, and an image of Durga, a modern image of Durga. Duff wrote, "In going through the streets of the native city, your eye might be chiefly arrested by the profusion of images unceremoniously exposed to sale like the commonest commodity. On inquiry, you are told that wealthy natives have images of the goddess in their houses made of gold, silver, brass, copper, crystal, stone, or mixed metal, which are daily worshipped. These are stable and permanent heirlooms in a family and are transmitted from sire to son like any other of the goods and chattels that become hereditary property. But besides these, you are next informed that for the ceremonial purpose of a great festival, multitudes of temporary images are prepared. These may be made of a composition of hay, sticks, clay, wood, or other cheap and light materials. They may be made of any size, from a few inches to 10, 12, or 20 feet in height. These images may be made by the worshiping parties themselves, and made so small and of substances so little expensive that the poorest may be provided with one as well as the richest. But if the parties do not choose to make the images themselves, they can be at no loss. There is an abundance of image makers by profession, and alas, in a city like Calcutta, the craft of image making is by far the most lucrative and unfluctuating of all crafts." Unquote. Alexander Duff noted the many strata of Calcutta's image users, registered in the materials that compose the imagery, which pertain to expense, but also to the conditions of use. Some images were crafted to last a very long time, while others were strictly temporary. Many were ritually destroyed at the end of the goddess's festival. Some images were immense and others very small. and all were for sale. Calcutta was a metropolis bustling in the image trade. The craft of making them was, Duff said, the city's most reliable commercial engine among its many crafts. The economic vitality of visual production and consumption made for a scene that the Scottish missionary found dizzying. Duff's disorienting odyssey in the visual world of 19th century Hinduism only intensified when he peered through a workshop door one day to witness the heart of visual production. It was there that he suddenly faced the source of his anxiety. And if you'll allow me one more long passage, I'd like to share that with you. He wrote, "Before, behind, and on the right and on the left, here and there and everywhere, you seem encompassed with a forest of images of different sizes and piles of limbs and bodies and fragments of images of diverse materials, finished and unfinished, in all the intermediate stages of progressive fabrication. But not only is the sense of vision affected, the ears too are assailed by the noise of implements, busily wielded by the workmen. You step aside, and standing at the door of an image maker's workshop, you gaze with wonder at the novel process. You recall to remembrance some striking passages in Isaiah and other prophets, descriptive of the very spectacle then exhibited to your own eyes. And you remember too how you once thought that such passages of sacred writ had now become altogether antiquated. In your native land, you never had seen a graven image nor a heathen temple," unquote. Duff's account carried no illustration of the scene he describes, but this image of modern production of statuettes of Durga in India may serve to register something of the sort of thing he saw. He proceeded to quote a series of passages from the book of Isaiah to register what was to him the striking likeness of ancient idolatry and modern India. The missionary's shock at what he saw bears further attention because we may find it in it something important about the construction and the operation of what I'm calling visual fields. The setting of Duff's experience is noteworthy. He is walking in the street at the time of a major festival and peers through a doorway into the interior of an image factory. The act brings to mind the famous scene described by Jean-Paul Sartre in his discussion of the gaze in Being and Nothingness. There, the philosopher conducts a thought experiment in which, moved by jealousy, curiosity, or vice, as he wrote, he placed himself outside an apartment door in order to peer surreptitiously through a keyhole at the occupant. The position allowed Sartre and Alexander Duff the advantage of constructing a particular relationship to what they saw. Vision became a way of subordinating the other, and the distance between seer and seen corresponded to a social difference that was registered in terms of gender in the case of the ex-lover, in Sartre's case, and in terms of race and religion in the instance of the colonial missionary. The occulted distance allowed a perspective, a kind of one-way gaze or visual field that indulged the viewer's sense of superiority. But here Sartre and Duff differ from one another. Whereas Duff was famous for insisting that elite Indian societies had to learn English in order to influence the lower classes in favor of English language and culture, Sartre subverted the superiority of his peeping Tom when someone approached him from behind and he became, in turn, the object of another's vision. Duff did not allow this transposition of the visual field that he described. He wanted it to stand as an enduring indictment of Indian idolatry that called for the urgent intervention of the British missionary effort to convert image worshipers into Bible readers. Faced with the dense organization of an entire society thriving on the commerce of images, Duff conjured a scene that was akin to European evocations of the sublime. The nature lover who encounters the immense scale of alpine mountains, whose looming presence threatens to consume the tiny human observer. But rather than figure the mountains as a divine intimation, as the work of nature's great architect, Duff faced the overwhelming world of Hindu image production, and he faced it as a call to arms. What he surveyed through the shop's doorway became the target for evangelical assault. The distance his view imposed was absolute, non-negotiable, and unilateral. As he put it, Duff was arrested by the spectacle of what he saw in the festive season of Durga's veneration. He said that his eyes were affected and his ears assailed by what he encountered, and he described what he saw, as I pointed out, as a forest of images. The teeming mass of images was a menace, a forest that might engulf the foreign missionary. What Duff described is quite the opposite of how the London Missionary Society presented Indian deities on the cover of its journal, Missionary Sketches, in 1819. Here we see 9 figures gathered in Bengal, including Vishnu, Ganesh, Krishna, Shiva, and Jugannatha. The figures are neatly arranged in a grid, reduced to the same size, seen frontally, and safely extracted from the dense ecology of their life worlds. Collected and extracted from their previous owners' devotions, homes, temples, markets, and shrines, the gods were displayed as a collection of specimens, each with its own fabulous story. In 1821, the same periodical featured Durga, the goddess whose festival Duff would later describe. An article accompanying this cover illustration offered the story of Durga and the accounts of frenzied crowds at Jugannatha, human sacrifice, and immolated widows as evidence of that, quote, the religion of the Hindus is a compound of falsehood and cruelty, unquote. Durga's story was considered a small specimen of the extravagances of Hindu mythology, according to the article. Hindu stories, quote, make no hesitation in giving tongues to stones and transforming trees into armed men, unquote. For the London Missionary Society, the result was a dangerous fiction. Quote, this may be allowed in a romance and in fables, but the modern Hindus are silly enough to believe most gravely that all this is the very truth, unquote. Such claims, according to the author, had their origin in Satan, the father of lies, and, quote, the inventions of wicked men, unquote. Hinduism was consistent with all forms of idolatry. Indeed, the article went on, all the religions of the earth and of all ages, except that only which is contained in the Bible, are evidently founded in lies and have the same diabolical origin, unquote. The point of the article's degrading visual and literary presentation of Indian deities was to foster a visceral sense of abasement that would move British readers to action. The account closed by pointing out to readers that the purposes of publishing the present sketch, like all such accounts, quote, is to excite your compassion and prayers in behalf of the heathen and your zeal and activity in furnishing pecuniary aid for the purpose of sending to them the blessings of the gospel, unquote. The humbling display of the divine figures and their stories was meant to highlight their absurdity to Europeans. Doing so was intended to evacuate the figures of any vitality, to deanimate the images, and to show them to be empty, ontologically neuter substance, the devices of primitive delusion and bad belief. In other words, the superstitions of polytheism. The study of religious imagery today works in nearly the opposite direction. A theme in recent scholarship has concerned what scholars widely refer to as the power of images. That is, the notion that images exert what can in some instances be an autonomous power, operating as unilateral sources of agency, independent agency. What's called the new materialism these days, invoked by many, has encouraged us to think about the way human and non-human actors interact and how objects and media exert the affordances of their material nature. Recognizing that remains a far cry from populating the universe with animated objects. So consideration of the power of images is not to suggest that objects are independently powered or ensouled subjects, but rather that scholars approach them with two critical realizations in mind. First, as Jane Bennett and others have considered, objects are not unitary atomic singularities. They are instead composed of many different things, including microbes and substances that change over time. This endows a thing with a certain agency inasmuch as its changes can cause other events. For instance, the fermentation of wine is an example. Yeast, a microscopic fungus that feeds on sugar, is added to crushed grapes. As the fungus consumes glucose and fructose in the must or the crushed grapes, it becomes ethanol. Second, nothing exists in isolation, but is part of an evolving set of relationships that last minutes or decades or longer and form an ecology in which a thing participates. Things exist in clusters or networks of other things and produce collective effects, something like the particles of water or air that respond collectively to energy, or better, as you see here, the flotsam consisting of bits of wood, foam, leafage, marine life, oil slicks, and plastic that form meandering shapes on the surface of the ocean, moving along in undulating patterns by wave action. There is no individual agent behind, no sovereign subject or consciousness behind the formation of islands of flotsam like this one, but rather a host of causes, human and otherwise. And the resulting formation exerts action on the world around it. As with this, it blocks out sunlight to the plants and animals beneath the surface and emits carcinogens as the plastic decays. In the case of wine fermentation, winemakers introduce the yeast, but the fermentation itself is the result of a chemical process. So now I'd like to move to a discussion of three key terms: gaze, image, and situation. I'd like to apply the observations I've made to these three ideas, which I think are fundamental to the study of religious visual culture. I've wanted to suggest that we see in contexts, and that those are composed of the many coordinates of visual fields that are formed by the configuration of interacting parts. The new materialism has usefully urged cultural analysts to attend to the agency of non-human actors that participate in assemblages. A traditional anthropocentric understanding of vision presumes that the sovereign subject directs seeing. But religious visual culture shows abundant evidence of other realities looking at humans. Things like spirits, gods, demons, the evil eye, ancestors, saints, and so forth. This gaze is experienced as an other acting on human beings and is responded to in a variety of ways. Viewers may respond by averting the gaze, by returning it, hiding from it, or redirecting it even. The image is where the gaze is encountered, the site where gaze and viewer, as it were, see one another.
Nee, ik hoor niks zo. Aan de achterkant kan het wel open eventueel.
This illustration from a 20th century catechetical manual captures the fundamental structure I am describing. My point is not to baptize vision in the Christian concept of the incarnation, but to regard this diagram as conveying something basic about religious visuality, how it works as a form of mediation. In this diagram, God looks at the human being and sees Jesus. Humanity, the human fellow here, looks at God and sees Jesus. So Jesus is the intervening image, the engagement of the two parties and the interpretation of one to the other. Viewers do not see the gaze of God, but feel it looking at them in the image, such that by responding to the image, they are responding to the gaze. This is a visual intimation of the spiritual other, whatever it may be. It doesn't have to be God, it could be any other kind of a human viewer or a non-human viewer. It is how we understand the other as an actor in the network of relations that comprises a visual field. Those of you familiar with Jacques Lacan's discussion of the gaze will recognize a certain similarity in this diagram. Here's the diagram from Lacan. Lacan stressed that gazes act on us by directing our attention to how images look back at us. He used this diagram to convey the gaze as an encounter, or what he described as the way in which a gaze entraps the viewer in an image. The gaze is always more than what seems to spring from our eyes, more than my willful act of vision. A gaze meets the eye in the screen of the image. For Lacan, the image is how a gaze entraps the viewer at the intersection of gaze and subject. Lacan's understanding of the gaze is something trained on the viewer through or in the form of an image makes the gaze itself an actor in a larger field. An image mediates gaze and viewer, serving as the place where each becomes visible to the other. This definition of the image stresses its agency, its instrumental role in mediating two agents. Alexander Duff described the gaze as it was explained to him by makers of images of Durga. If, he wrote, you ask them, do you really believe that with your own hands you can, out of straw and wood and clay, fabricate a god before which you may fall down and worship? He asked them. No, he was told, we believe no such thing. When Duff asked them what they believed, he was told that they produce the image and the priest consecrates it, inviting the goddess to take possession of the image. As a result, the image, quote, is believed to be truly animated by divinity, to be real, proper, and legitimate object of worship. Having eyes, it can now behold the various acts of homage rendered by adoring votaries, he continued. Having ears, it can be charmed by the symphonies of music and song. Having nostrils, it can be regaled with the sweet-smelling savor of incense and perfume. Having a mouth, it can be luxuriated with the graceful delicacies of the rich banquet that is spread out before it, unquote. The image really became an agent, and that is what deeply concerned him in Hindu practice. If Duff was incredulous about calling a deity into an image, he was aghast to learn that the goddess was dismissed from the image at the end of the festival, and that her image was then ritually demolished in a thrall on the shores of the Ganges. The forest of images overwhelmed this bewildered Protestant observer. Here is a present-day instance of the event on the Yamuna River in Delhi. And here is Duff musing on what he witnessed when the image was destroyed. "Who can depict the wondrous spectacle," he wrote. "The numbers without number, the fantastic equipages of every rank and grade, the variegated costumes of every caste and sect, the wild and frenzied mental excitements of myriads of spectators intoxicated with the scene, the breaking, crashing, and sinking of hundreds of dispossessed images along the margin and over the surface of the mighty stream, amid the loud, shrill dissonance of 1,000 untuneful instruments. Here language entirely fails. Imagination itself must sink down with wings collapsed," unquote. Duff's befuddlement and alienation at what he witnessed underscores his very different sense of the scene. Yet his description goes far to limn the embodied reality of a visual field. As a devotee, it is something one enters and participates in as a festival intended to evoke merriment. Durga worship, Durga Puja, invites public celebration that turns on spectacle. Spectacle is the point. The colorful images of the goddess are exhibited in temporary structures called pandals, which are draped with lights that attract mulling throngs in the nocturnal streets of Bengali cities. Participants inhabit a dazzling visual field of interacting agents, crowds of devotees, streets and pandals, cult images, webs of colored lights, music, song, and revelry. In limning the scene, Duff helps us think about its structure in spite of himself. It appeared chaotic to him, but not to its participants. What was the difference? I would like to borrow a term from rhetorical theory to help get at what that was. That term, the third that I want to define here, is situation. A rhetorical situation refers to conditions that contribute to the production of discourse that seeks to effect change in an audience. When applied to the dynamics of a visual field, a situation designates the particular configuration of agents that is driven by a purpose, problem, or sense of occasion. A visual situation tends to produce a disposition, seeks to move viewers, to dispose them toward a certain end. This is just how Sartre characterized the ensemble of elements comprising the act of his jealous keyhole espionage, a situation that organized his relation to the setting and the person upon whom he was spying. And he used the term situation in describing it. Sartre spoke of the keyhole as an instrument and asserted that quote, the ensemble is a real system, a disposition of means in view of an end, unquote. A visual field becomes a dispositive, an apparatus that works on viewers using images as a kind of visual technology within a configuration of other actors. Of course, the result is not strictly determinative, no more than is any political speech able to rouse all listeners into a single state of conviction. But the current generated by the situation runs in a direction in which many participants are inclined to go. A situation disposes viewers by immersing them in a field of many interacting things. Viewers in relation to other viewers, in relation to a place, in relation to an atmosphere, in relation to an image or an object, and in relation to the gaze of another materialized by an image. A situation is a visual configuration that tends to attach itself to an object or a person through the interface of an image or a particular point of view. A good example of this is a roadside vista, or scenic view. The sign, for instance, you see here, beckons drivers to pull over and enjoy the view, to stop and be arrested by what is in front of them. The scene or the vista is already there, waiting for those who want to slip into that gaze and see it. Viewers enter the scene, which consists of what they will see, but it is also the manner in which they see it, the distance, the elevation, the framing, the object, and those gathered there, gawking, gasping, crowding for the best position. A visual situation is a kind of scene or scenario, a configuration of parts that forms a field in which viewers themselves participate. They are agents among other agents, acted upon what they see by what they see, no less than beholding what they see, assuming, of course, that they wish to see what the scene offers. This poster is a humorous reminder that viewers never forfeit all of their agency. That is, if they do not have to see what the scene would have them see, as these children here can ignore their irate father, preferring to look at their books than to take in the vast scene behind them. Another way of approaching the construction of vision is to think of a situation as operating something like a traffic zone, where the image is a traffic light that regulates various lanes of intersecting traffic. The situation is not the colored rays emitted by the light, but the entire configuration of cars, painted lines, curbs, streets, and lights. And the gaze of the law in the form of traffic signs and the codes they invoke. And sometimes this gaze takes the more literal form of a radar or police personnel watching. Each of these actors is a material reality with its own affordances and vicissitudes of material decay. Paint fades, lights lose electrical power or malfunction, the pavement coated in oil or water fails to provide traction, curbs crumble, sink or vanish beneath grass, cars break down and their drivers drive fast or slow, they stall, they delay, they make mistakes. When all of these actors work together, when their affordances maximize their interaction, the traffic flow is at an optimum. When one of them malfunctions, the problem can ripple across the network and produce chain reactions such that the network itself acts destructively. So this is a way of distributing agency across the network rather than investing it only in the traffic light or only in the driver in order to arrive at a more robust account of how vision happens. This example helps us in at least three ways, and I'll close with these. The first, it helps balance the overemphasis on the unitary agent in lived religion. When many Christians, including Alexander Duff, look at the Bible, they may see something, they may see it as the work of a single author, God, as in this Reformation Bible cover from an early edition of Luther's Bible. You can see God above writing the folios, and then the cherubs assemble it into a codex below. However, when textual critics treat the biblical manuscripts, such as the unitary author dissolves into recensions of historical and philological sources, a host of manuscript traditions with their own genealogies and layers of redaction. You can see that laid out here in a series, a chart on Bible translations. For scholars, quite often, the Bible is not a book, but something more like a library, a curated collection of diverse texts by many authors. The situation as traffic zone urges us to recognize many different players in a multi-causal scenario rather than reduce the human or the divine agent to a single unilateral causality. That is why Alexander Duff objected strenuously to any use of the Bible as a textbook in schools that failed to avow its unique capacity, quote, as what he called, quote, Jehovah's holy oracles, unquote. This meant that the sacred volume was, as he said, never for the parsing, syntactical, and sundry other grammatical exercises of linguistic acquisition, unquote. Such uses were likely, in Duff's view, to lower the Bible from its unapproachable eminence of sacredness as the book of books, as he called it. Second importance for this, this model of thinking about image, experience of imagery. Everyone entering a traffic intersection brings a past with them. Their situations are different, driven by varying purposes. Thus, situation is always bigger than place. Imagine what pilgrims to Santiago de Compostela, who have spent days or weeks on the road, feel and see when they enter the cathedral in comparison to the tourists who slide off their air-conditioned bus for a 10-minute tour of the cathedral before rushing away to lunch. The two groups experience the same place, but with entirely different situations. Finally, the traffic zone also suggests something important about the nature of gaze and image. The traffic light is the law looking at drivers, telling them what they can move, when they can move, and when they must stop. The light is an image that delivers this gaze. It is not the law, but it acts in the place of it such that to disobey the light signal is to disobey the law. This recalls what Iconodules said to justify icons. To disrespect the image of the emperor was to convey disrespect to his very person. A situation makes a gaze visible and interactive in an arc from the surface of an image to the bodies of those before it. Understanding image and gaze must mean understanding the situation of viewers before the imagery. To these three, let me end with a fourth point that pertains to the academic study of religion. The relevance of recognizing the gaze as manifested in a pious viewer's relation to an image could not be greater for the study of religion because it allows scholars to include what devotees report is behind the image looking at them. Without the forest of images, without the full ecology that forms the world in which an image lives, scholars will have no way of studying the gaze of beings they cannot see. Thank you.
Professor Morgan, thank you so much. That was an incredibly generative talk, and I could not think of a better way to get us started. We're going to have these ideas floating around in our heads for the next couple days in all of the conversations, I'm sure. So thank you very much for this keynote. I believe we now have the ability to take questions both online and offline. I'm not sure how our microphones work, so probably I will be repeating some of the questions, but we are happy to take questions both on and offline. Yeah, George. Do we have, great, we have a connected microphone, even easier.
Thank you very much. This was really fascinating. I was wondering if one can see gaze as an act that belongs to a more complex, multifaceted action. So I'm thinking of an Orthodox setting where there is an icon, let's say an icon of the Virgin Mary, and obviously the first thing that will trigger you to go to that icon is the gaze, and it's the visual. but then I may go and touch the icon and then maybe put my hand on my heart or my mouth to kiss it. Or somebody else may light a candle and put it in front of the icon, maybe not touching the icon, but there is a bit of a distance, and the icon can also be taken in a procession, let's say. So there, and once it's taken into procession, then that is an action by itself, but then the others are gazing at it and either virtually extending their hand and not touching it, but as if they are touching it. So can we see gaze as part of a more complex action? And where would that fit in the theory?
Thank you very much for that question. Indeed, I think what you're describing is really important. One could think about the first thing one encounters entering the interior of the sanctuary is already shaping one into a gaze. People, particularly since often the image of Our Lady is what is the first icon one encounters. And people sometimes kiss it, and depending on the Orthodox tradition. So it sets up a spatial relationship with the body, and one responds accordingly and enters this space. And sometimes, I've argued in the past that we should think about gazes in more plastic, participative ways. People enter the gaze, and they aren't just passive. They participate in enacting the gaze, as you're describing, by approaching the image, touching it, praying to it, or before it rather, and then participating with other people there. So you can be by yourself, for instance, in a devotional moment, but also in a religious service. Liturgically, there's several different players in this. There's the music and the ritual action, and there's the group. So all of these things have to be integrated. The other thing your question occurred to me is there's not just one gaze. There are many gazes, many different gazes, a kind of a relationship. And there are different relationships. Some stress fear, some stress happiness, some stress solemnity, so we should try to describe the spatial configuration of the relationships and understand the variety of gazes that can be part of worship.
Thank you. I see online that Eric has raised his hand. I don't know if he can unmute himself or if we need somebody to unmute him, but Eric, if you want to ask your question.
Yeah, I think I'm unmuted. Thank you so very much for your great lecture. I found it very fascinating. And it relates to the previous question, actually. You talk about vision and view and the experience of the imagery. But I was wondering, is in other senses also involved? Touch was mentioned, but the gaze as a form of touch or a way of touching. So it's not only vision, but it is also, you can feel when someone is staring in your back, or or an icon, the oil that's near it is also becoming more or less sacred or useful. In a way, it's beaming out. It is that touching. That's what I wonder, if it's not good to the sense of vision.
That's very good. I quite agree. The senses are not separate. Our brains interweave them so that we do feel the touch of vision, and we imagine the pleasure of touching something that we see. Hearing often, I'm always struck by, depending on, sometimes when I close my eyes, I can hear better. Or sometimes I find I have to see the speaker in order to hear better. It just depends on the situation. So, I think to study anything like gaze in its robust embodied state, we must attend to the interrelationships of our senses. And we have to do that when we study Christian ritual because the ritual itself is multisensorial. It's not just seen, it's not just heard, it's not just felt, it's all of those. People are always expanding the base of the senses. Some scholars, neurologists indicate we have more than 5 senses. There are many more senses that can be described as organizing human feeling and knowledge. So I think our work is really just beginning to understand the complexity of religious experience.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks. I think I saw also online Mersha. I don't know if they are able to ask their question.
Yes, can you hear me? Thank you.
Yes.
All right, thank you so much. I'm Marsha from Germany and surrounding diocese of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. And my bishop, His Grace Abuna Dionysios, is also in the room, and he's so happy to see this conference going on. And I want to congratulate the organizers of this interesting conference. My question goes to the project team, actually. We say that one of the wisdoms a researcher needs to have in choosing a research topic is to prove the fact that he or she will be setting foot on a topic where there won't be scarcity of data. I think initiators of this ARC project are wise in making sure that they won't suffer from a lack of research data. If there are churches where religious visuality plays a key role, is the Ethiopian Orthodox Church in particular, and the Oriental Church in general, of course, as you know. So I'm so happy to learn that this exciting project is already in progress, of course, focusing on the Oriental Orthodox Church in Europe. And I wish the project team to come up with a successful result. Having said that, I want to pose a couple of small questions to the project team. When you observe religious images and the material cultures in these churches, you obviously try to investigate the power these images have in connecting the laity, the faithful to their church, and ultimately to God. But I want to ask you if it is in your research agenda, if and how those images help the laity to strengthen their relationships as community, at the venue to demonstrate their identity to their host society and even influencing them. That's my question. I hope you heard me. Thank you.
Thank you. I can say a couple things, but if anyone else from the team wants to pop in, of course, please do. Thank you for the encouragement and for the question. And I think this is a really nice question because I think what Professor Morgan has offered us helps us to think precisely about this kind of question, right? That it's not, in fact, just a single believer or parishioner encountering an icon, but in fact that these icons do things that in a larger field. You know, the field perhaps includes the entire church. It includes, you know, a given parish, but it might include the church as a whole. It not only does, say, the individual act of encountering it during worship, but it might have a kind of educational or didactic aspect as well. So I think that actually Professor Morgan has helped provide us with a vocabulary to think about what these images do and the way in which we need to make sure that we are not just thinking about them as a kind of individual encounter, but in fact this broader field, this ecology of these images. So I hope that gets at what you are asking, but I think it's a very important question as we go forward with our research. Thank you. Yeah, I think maybe somebody wrote out a question. Do you guys in the back have that?
There is a question. I will read it. So, in your opinion, question by Alwyn. In your opinion, how well has Orthodoxy helped in preserving the ethno-religious identity of various Christian communities across the Middle East and Europe? So it's more a question for the team, I guess. So if someone wants to answer to that.
You've got the mic back there. I answered the last one.
I think it is precisely the question we are trying to answer. So it's a bit early, I think, to really answer, but I guess we are really trying to find how traditions are preserved, reinvented, and how it helps or not to keep the identity or to preserve the ethno-religious identity of the people who immigrated from the Middle East.
Sure, of course.
Maybe one can also think of it the opposite way, is the ethno-religious identity strengthening the Orthodoxy or the church, in the sense that it is really your ethnicity sometimes that is driving you to go to the church and not singing the psalms, you know.
Getting right at the heart of the project here, I think. I love it. Yeah. Yeah, Polycarpus, please.
I have a question to Professor Morgan about indwelling power of God. You mentioned the statues of Durga and how the devotees viewed these statues. They did not worship them, but when the priests consecrated them, they saw that there was indwelling power of God.
Right.
And it really struck me, this is not all that different from the Judeo-Christian tradition, God indwelling in his saints. So is there any connection between these two different traditions and religions, or is it the human approach to the sacred?
Yeah. Oh, thank you. It is striking. You're right. There are fascinating similarities. One thinks, for instance, in the Hebrew Bible of Yahweh descending to the ark. He didn't stay in the ark, but he did come down on ritual occasions, particular ritual occasions. But the ark remained a very sacred object. It wasn't God, but it was the place where God dwelled on ritual occasions. So this is not dramatically dissimilar to Hindu practice. And one thinks of important images and statuary in the Christian world as no one, I mean, it's rare that I've ever encountered anyone who says that's the Virgin Mary, but she is specially present through the icon or through the cult image, through the shrine image. Or one thinks of important places of saints, their burial sites or shrines. We need a more, I think, subtle way of understanding how images work, so that we can get at more subtly what's happening, you know, in acts of devotion and worship, and not slide into the crude idol versus icon sort of distinction. I don't think it's too crude. It doesn't capture the subtlety of lived human experience and of the encounter of the divine. This is something that, of course, scholars don't share the faith of the people they study, but there is some sense in which we have to, as scholars, honor what people report if we really want to try to understand what's going on. That's what I was getting at the very end of my talk. You know, if we come up with a concept of the gaze that doesn't require us to negate the viewer behind the image, but to describe response to the image as if it indeed is a channel of vision, then we can understand better, and we don't have to be, embrace a kind of unbelief as the condition for studying images. We can simply grant that this is what people report and then develop a richer description.
Thank you. I think I saw Dr. Boylston had raised his hand online.
Yeah, hello, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. Hi from Scotland, and thank you for this lovely talk. Your use of Lacan, I really hope this question makes sense. Your use of Lacan got me wondering about the idea of a lack within the gaze, of something incomplete or lacking. I'm thinking of perhaps Matthijs van der Poort's work on the Baroque, suggesting that the very ornateness of Baroque imagery within Catholic churches sort of reflects an inadequacy or lack within the image that speaks to the infinitude beyond or within it.
Right.
And I'm comparing that in my mind to my own work in Ethiopia, where I suspect that people might not agree with the idea of a lack in the image. I don't think that would be understood as something lacking. So I'm wondering whether this might point us towards a certain kind of distinction that may be present within Orthodox and some Catholic traditions, or how we might think about this sort of relationship between fullness and lack that I think Lacan points us towards it, but many other thinkers of images as well, and that I think is interestingly proposed by your model of the gaze as well. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, this is slightly rambling, but I hope it points towards something.
Fascinating. Yes. Yeah. No, it's quite fascinating. I think you can find evidence of that lack in different places. I mean, if you look at apologetics in the classic history of the defense of icons, there's the insistence that the icon is not the referent. But then sussing out exactly its relationship to the referent is the really interesting thing in terms of lived devotional practices. But there's this difference is posited as a kind of distinction that they wanted to have in place. And they come up with interesting, subtle distinctions about the mode of worship, this kind of thing. But there's this sense also, you mentioned, I'm thinking, for instance, the Brazilian Baroque, which is just amazing. You go into these churches in Minas Gerais, for instance, and see these just fantastic interiors, or Mexican Baroque interiors, really remarkable, where it's a surfeit, but the surfeit is also, in some sense, a deferral, because it fails to be what it's referring to. It evokes it, but that's not the end. The evocation of experience is what counts. So it's a launching site in some sense, a participatory. It's a gesture invoking participation, and whether it works or not is, some people it doesn't work. Even within that tradition, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So, there are different ways of thinking about it. I mean, obviously, Lacan is thinking in terms of psychoanalytic models of lack that these other examples I cite probably wouldn't articulate in any way.
Wonderful. And Hoptum, do you want to ask your question?
Okay, thank you, Chris. Thank you, Professor Morgan. Interesting lecture, and also for the books. As my colleagues mentioned, we have enjoyed it. My question is regarding the image you showed as the sin bearer. Jesus Christ on the cross and behind God.
Yeah.
So the sin bearer represents God. Mm-hmm. But there are also Christians who say the sin bearer blocks me to see God. I am referring to, in general, to other images, mm-hmm. because the images divert, or the icons divert the centrality of the faith. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if you have studied gaze also from that aspect.
Yeah. Okay. Can you give me an example of what you're talking about?
For example, the icons divert the centrality of faith from God?
Well, I mean, you can speak to the Orthodox tradition much better than I can, but the theology of that diagram I showed you is that God is invisible. And that's why they represent him in that diagram with words, G-O-D, because you can't see him. He's not an image, but he is himself an action of seeing. And the theology there was he demands righteousness, and humans, the theology said, cannot provide that righteousness. So if God saw humans, he would annihilate them. That's why Christ mediates, because in effect, Christ blocks God's vision of human imperfection. And humans can't see God. He's incomprehensible. To see him would be to reduce him to a finite reality. And therefore they see Jesus and can recognize their salvation. So this is the negotiation, the two-way negotiation that interesting diagram was trying to get at. In terms of icons, I return once again to this idea that the icon, I mean, one way that iconographers explain the distortions, the non-naturalistic representation of figures, is because they don't want the image to be confused with its referent. The image is not the saint. It refers to the saint. It's a channel, a conduit for directing praise, because the classic argument is that praise passes through the image and is delivered to the heavenly referent, but should not be confused with it. That deferral of full presence will only be removed at the end of time, when people, or in death, when people join the saint, the communion of saints in heaven. So it comes back to Tom Boyle's question about the lack. The lack is always there because of this ontological distinction. I don't know if that helps at all. But.
Thank you. Do we? Yeah, more Polycarpos.
Yes, hello. Thank you so much for... Can I ask my question? Okay,
I can hear you.
Sorry. This is all confusing with all this technology, and I'm seeing you, you're not seeing me. I was wondering, what happens if the referee and the image do become confused? Because we do know instances of that being the case. Sure. And I was wondering how material religion fits into your theory of the vision and the religious gaze. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I approach it as a material culturalist, as a scholar, not as I don't approach it theologically, so I don't have a normative view. I like to describe whatever I'm studying and to do so in a full way. So when people do talk about, I'm extremely interested. I mean, my sort of core interest is the agency of images. How do they act on us? How do they act on human viewers? What do people report? How do they experience these things? Because I don't think it's helpful to just treat an image as a text, something that neutrally delivers information and then can be forgotten. Images have pushback, they have presence. The term that people like to use is recalcitrance. They resist our domination of them. They don't agree with us. They change over time. They sometimes they challenge us. All of those factors, those different forms of relationship are what I want to try to capture in a description of what's happening when people use images in religious practices. So, and sometimes they do human beings get very attached to their favorite things, their favorite hymnal. And I don't know if you've studied congregations when they have to update a hymnal. Sometimes it's a huge crisis. They just can't stand the idea of losing the hymnal that grandpa and grandma always used. You know, it's a threat to their connection to tradition. So if you change the instrumentation, you change their relationship to what's always been there. So we have to take these things, I have to recognize this inherently conservative nature of religious artifacts, and the attachment that they achieve in human practice. So image worship would be just another example of that intense connection to objects that can maybe tell us a lot about what's going on in that visual community.
My question is about the situation that you described, the technical term. You told us about the experience of a tourist and a pilgrim going to Santiago de Compostela.
Mm-hmm.
The pilgrim has a preparation,
Yeah.
reflection, and longing through the pilgrimage to see and arrive at the destination, whereas the tourist has no preparation.
Yeah. Well, they have a preparation, but it's not at all like.
That's true.
Yeah.
But the question, in relation to this, there is a philosophical aspect now, somebody writing a book about desire. For example, whether we, let's say, put it in technological terms, whether we desire the smartphone or the smartphone desires us. And if you relate it to the image, is it the person who desires the image or the image desires the person? And the experience of the pilgrim and the tourist in relation to that.
Yeah. Yeah, those are that's interesting. I mean, the smartphone has become a kind of prosthesis for many of us. We're cut off from the world. The other day when the Facebook went down and Instagram and whatever else they own, Zuckerberg owns, I think WhatsApp, I can't remember. Suddenly the social platforms that people stand on every day, practically every hour of every day, are no longer there. And they didn't know what to do. I mean, people were cut off. So these media, I mean, this is the power of media. They interfold with our bodies. Literally, a phone, you know, it fits in the hand, and it's like another organ that we have, and we feel something's been severed from us organically when we forget the phone or the phone stops working or whatever. So there's an interesting phenomenology of these devices, and images can operate in a comparable way. So that's one thing I said. And you know, the whole issue of the pilgrim versus the tourist. You know, the tourist is collecting moments really to share with people back home, and they never leave the bubble, the language bubble. They're on a tour bus. Everyone speaks the same language. The tour leader speaks their language, and they get off, they do the 10-minute tour, and then they leave. So what, you know, they're after something else. And I don't want to be disparaging, but it's just not at all similar to the pilgrim, who's you know, otherwise quite engaged in the practice. And the desire you mentioned is key, really, isn't it? It's driving the pilgrim, and it's driving the tourist too, but these are not the same modes of desire. And the value of talking about the image desire, the image's desire, I think that's a great way to frame it, because we're not complete. You know, we need things, and we enter into intense relationships with things, and people too. But things, you know, we need our clothing, we need our tools, we need our books, we need our phones, we need our worship spaces, and we need our icons, all these things. And they're more than just neutral, empty placeholders. They have a presence, and they have their own, the term now people like to use is their affordances, the things that can get done with them that can't get done with other things. So we need to think about images, and Tom Mitchell asks a basic question: what is it the image wants? I think it's a great way to go about it, because that gets us out of our heads and we start thinking about the image as an agent. What does it want? Well, one of the things it wants to be seen. It wants to be visually engaged. And images aren't all the same, so that means images must be want to seen in different circumstances, under different conditions. So once we start to back up and describe these things, I think we'll come up with much richer accounts of visual piety, of the visual practices of devotion and worship.
Wonderful, thank you. My colleagues are motioning that I'm supposed to move towards the reception, and this is where the hybrid model, I think we've done a pretty wonderful job here today with that, but of course I wish that I had you here, because then I would grab you and say, you know, I love this ecology idea, and then we'd have a drink and we could do all of that. So I think we've done quite well with the hybrid model, but it's too bad that we don't have you here with us. But thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Morgan, for this incredibly generative conversation and talk. And as I said before, this is going to give us a lot of food for thought as we go forward the next few days. So thank you again for accepting the invitation from all of us at the team. So
thank you very much. It was great, and I'm sorry I can't be with you. Best wishes for your conference. I'll be tuning in tomorrow. So.
Wonderful. We look forward to it.
Great.
Us here, we can move towards reception.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.